This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Friday the 5th of August 2022. It's Julian Nagelsmann's second season as Bayern Munich coach and the first game of the new Bundesliga season away at Eintracht Frankfurt, reigning Europa League winners with one of the fiercest home atmospheres. Nagelsmann, after his poor Champions League run the previous season, needs to get this one off to a positive start.
And the 60th Bundesliga season is underway.
And this was the moment I realised I didn't understand Julian Nagelsmann. I'd been tracking Nagelsmann's career all the way back to his time at Hoffenheim, where he became a first-team Bundesliga coach at a ridiculous 28 years old. And I found that Nagelsmann's reputation for being a skilled tactician was born almost immediately. Within just 3 different Hoffenheim games, I saw his team play in possession 3-2-2-3, 3-1-4-2, 3-1-3-3, and out of possession 5-3-2 and 4-4-2. So straight away things were mildly confusing. But Nagelsmann wasn't doing this just to be novel or to experiment. His changes in formation were all about adapting to the opposition. And in my quest to define Nagelsmann's tactical philosophy, that became the first important pillar: always adapt to the opposition. The nature of that adaptation turned out to be quite interesting. Nagelsmann once said in an interview about his tactics that most coaches like to stretch the opposition midfield line, but I prefer to pull the defenders apart and make space in the final third. And that was an important clue about all these structural changes. For example, here's Nagelsmann's Hoffenheim. They're building up in a 3-1-3-3 against a compact 4-4-2. And because it's a back three, this first line is relatively narrow, meaning the player that's likely to pressure the left back, the right midfielder, can stay compact. However, Hoffenheim's attacking line is much wider, 5 players spread across the pitch, with a winger hugging each touchline. So if the ball goes out to the left winger, the player closing him down, this right back, would have to come all the way out. But that of course would create space between the fullback and centre back, which Hoffenheim could look to exploit. And that's what Nagelsmann means by stretching the defensive line rather than the midfield line, which has stayed compact. When he moved on to coach Leipzig, Nagelsmann actually faced a lot of 5 at the back systems, like this 5-3-2, and here this principle became even more important. Again, it's 3 at the back, the opposition midfielder can stay compact while pressuring the left centre back, but the wing back is centred out by the winger, isolating the right back 1 versus 1. So you've managed to create space even against a low and compact block. As you can imagine, things change a lot though against a more aggressive opponent. Here, Borussia Mönchengladbach are pressing from a 5-2-3 shape, with wing backs pushing up when the fullback is on their side. So when the ball goes across, you see the other one step up. And this is where Nagelsmann will go from a narrow 3 at the back to a wide 4 at the back, because this time you're not interested in stretching the defensive line, you want to stretch the midfield line of 4 so you can bypass this press. So just like before, the width tempts the wing backs outwards, creating a gap that you can exploit. So despite the initial bemusement over the formations, it actually told me 2 very useful things about Nagelsmann as a coach. The first, like I said, is his desire to adapt, and the second is that he views the game largely in terms of space. He looks at the opposition formation and designs his own structure to create space in specific areas, which means that while those structures do change from game to game, within any one game you would see the same shape occurring repeatedly. Each position is there for a reason, so players are sticking closely to the zones they're assigned. And all this made sense. After all, I've covered a lot of positionally rigid coaches on the channel already, the likes of Pep Guardiola, Roberto De Zerbi, Xavi Hernandez. However, it became quickly apparent that there was something different about Nagelsmann. The games that I was watching didn't entirely resemble those that I was familiar with. And then I realised something else very important was happening. The sponsor of today's video is Squarespace, and like Nagelsmann is a kind of all-in-one manager, so Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. Yeah, I'm going with that. So the main selling point for me is the website builder. So you start with a professional template, but then the Fluid engine makes it really easy to customize that and make it your own, as I did with Raquelme here. But on top of that, Squarespace has a bunch of tools to help you grow as a business, so you can build email campaigns, create new revenue streams with merch and so on. So that's really useful if you're just starting out as a new business. So you can check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and if you're ready, you can go to squarespace.com/thepurestfootball for 10% off your first website or domain. By this point, I was very much into the RB Leipzig era of Nagelsmann's career, and here the football suddenly got a lot quicker. Rather than patient circulation, there was a clear intention to get the ball forward quickly, which often meant finding the central routes between the lines. From there, you'd see a lot of third-man combinations off the centre forward, from which you could attack the back line. But in any side, there is an inherent risk to building through the middle like this, especially if your players are spread out. A central dispossession means it's really difficult to counterpress and quite easy for your opponent to play forward and isolate your defenders. And this was where Nagelsmann was different. Rather than being completely strict in rationally occupying space, his players would get a lot closer together, often congregating between the lines. That difference in positioning could be subtle, maybe only a couple of meters, but when you're playing riskier balls through the middle, one, it gives more options to play third-man combinations, but also when you lose the ball, players are closer to it in order to counterpress immediately. And this informed my next important discovery, because yes, he was an attacking coach, but actually the majority of Nagelsmann's tactical decisions had a lot more to do with defending. As a coach, you must always assume you are going to lose the ball, he said. Which brings me to one of Nagelsmann's most famous ideas within tactical spheres, the concept of relative width. Now, I've seen this go by other names, minimum width, variable width, but the idea is quite simple. Rather than having both wingers hugging the touchline at all times, Nagelsmann's wingers will only stay as wide as they need to be. Of course, on the ball side, that will often be on the touchline, in order to stretch the defensive line like we've talked about. But on the far side, you'll notice the winger is a lot narrower. And when the ball switches sides, the opposite happens. You'll also see narrow wingers in offensive transitions and in situations like this, where the ball is being delivered into the box. So what's going on here? Well, if we rewind this clip, we get a pretty good idea. Initially, you can see the right winger, Kluivert, step back towards the touchline as the ball goes to his side. However, as soon as the pass is played centrally and Poulsen receives between the lines, he begins to dart inside, so he can receive the ball closer to the box. So the width is relative to the situation. The winger has started wide to stretch the defence, but as soon as that becomes unnecessary, when Leipzig break the lines with a pass, that width has sort of done its job. He's now much more of a threat receiving closer to the box than out on the touchline. And because the far side winger always tucks in, you effectively get one extra body in the box from crosses. But this relative width serves an important defensive purpose as well, because the narrower your front line is, the more players you once again have around to counterpress. At Leipzig, and especially Bayern, you'd have these scenarios with both wingers narrow and this block of players in the box. So when the cross comes in, everyone is ready to jump on rebounds, ricochets, and of course press if it falls to an opponent. And you'd end up with wave after wave of cross and counterpress. So clearly I had to add gegenpressing to my list of principles as the main reason behind player proximity and relative width. Which brought me to what I thought was the final element of Nagelsmann's principles, and that was his philosophy out of possession. Now, what was interesting was that Nagelsmann had coached three very different teams. Hoffenheim were relegation threatened when he took over, Leipzig wanted to secure Champions League football, and Bayern, of course, needed to win the league. So obviously his defensive approaches had to differ greatly. At Hoffenheim, he was known for his compact, well-organised 5-3-2, which of course we never saw at Bayern. However, I did find one principle that appeared to span across his career, and that was his use of pressing traps. So even at Hoffenheim, where his team was not as aggressive, they were still intents to make life uncomfortable. We can see them here in their 5-3-2 shape, but rather than sit back and soak up pressure, they're waiting for an opportunity to apply it. In this case, the trigger is this backwards pass to the right back. That pressure forces another backwards pass, and from here it's all about angles. Hoffenheim are actually outnumbered, but the angle of the forward's run is going to cut out both of these passing lanes. The second forward is already preempting the pass out wide, and again, look at the angle of his approach, forcing the next pass down the touchline. And this is really what we mean by the pressing trap, because he's not actively trying to win the ball here, but force the opponent into a position of disadvantage, moving the ball down the line where 5 Hoffenheim players have clustered. Fast forward to his time at Bayern, and although the press is much more aggressive and happening higher up the pitch, the same principles do remain. Angled runs, forcing balls down the touchline. So by now I had a reasonably good picture of Nagelsmann the coach. His experience across very different jobs had made him highly adaptable. He was open to a number of tactical setups that gave him spatial advantages, but he could also be very pragmatic off the ball and explore details in and out of possession that enhanced his team's solidity. Not an easy manager to understand, but definitely consistent principles were there. And then came this match.
And the 60th Bundesliga season is underway.
In this league opener against Frankfurt and several matches following, Nagelsmann set Bayern up in a 4-2-2-2 with a consistent double pivot, playmakers that could be as narrow or wide as they wanted to be, and forwards with complete freedom to drop and rotate. And this didn't seem right. Now, on paper, this system does make sense for a Nagelsmann team. After all, the fluidity of the front four means you'll continue to get players very close together and between the lines, creating conditions for quick central passes and counter-pressing. And of course, they can still remain very aggressive out of possession. So some of these principles definitely still held true. But those that I considered really fundamental to Nagelsmann's approach had been discarded. He was seemingly no longer adapting to the opposition. He played the system against 5 at the back, against 4 at the back, against low blocks, high press, but even more importantly, Nagelsmann was no longer manipulating space by implementing his rigid structure. Width wasn't just relative here, it was optional, and since it was often provided by the fullbacks, sometimes it didn't arrive until later in the build-up. Now, watching this team, his principles of play had remained, the intent to manipulate space was there, but by taking away that consistent structure, he was essentially allowing his players to figure it out by themselves. And it turns out that all of this had been a conscious decision by Nagelsmann in the pre-season. He admitted in an interview that while his success had been down to tactical complexity and adapting to the opposition, it wasn't something that was always appreciated at big clubs like Bayern. He said that he would make a conscious effort to focus more on themselves, less on the opposition, and give the leading players more input on how the team would play. And for a while, this focus on themselves, a less rigid game with more emphasis on individual talent, produced some outrageous football. You could see certain players, the likes of Sané, Musiala, Gnabry, Mane, thrive in this environment. Unfortunately, this experiment didn't last long. Early in the season, Bayern went 4 league games without winning, and Nagelsmann was back to his more rigid structures by the time he was dismissed. But even so, I wouldn't put it past him trying something like this again, because if I've learned anything while making this video, it's that nobody will ever truly understand Julian Nagelsmann. He's not tied to any one footballing philosophy. He's willing to learn, experiment, and problem solve based on whatever circumstances he's given, and that, to me, makes him one of the most fascinating figures in football today. At the time of recording, Nagelsmann's contract with the German national team expires at the end of the 2024 Euros, so there'll be plenty of teams chasing his signature for the next season. And I'd love to know in the comments which club you think would best suit Julian Nagelsmann. I'm super interested to hear what you think, maybe even what kind of tactics he'd implement at said club. I'm also going to be having that discussion in a bonus podcast over on Patreon, so check that out if you're interested. The link is on screen and in the description. But otherwise, I hope you like this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.